We begin with a poem today. This poem is from Steve and it reflects on the gospel passage. So whatever you need to do to get into a listening space for a poem, I invite you to do that now. Maybe some deep breaths, maybe relaxing any tension in your body, or just becoming really present. Here's the poem. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Mark 10, beginning at verse 9. Don't pick this up as a club to beat divorcees. It's already caused enough harm. Only men had the power to marry or divorce. Jesus was protecting women from being used and discarded. Jesus' accusers want to know what is lawful, but he always seeks what is life-giving. Sometimes when a couple has married, it's not God that has joined them. What God has joined together is a whole person. Don't let a bad marriage break them. Sometimes what keeps the bent over woman down is a marriage from which Jesus would set her free. Sometimes the paralyzed need to get up and walk away first. Only then can the healing begin. Sometimes when Jesus says, "Follow me," there are things he wants one to leave behind. Always and ever, Jesus invites us not toward what is lawful, but what is life-giving. Not toward what is lawful, but what is life-giving. It's hard to grasp that reality that Jesus invites us not towards what we should be doing, but what we could be doing, what is life-giving. When there are so many ideas about how we should live, laws, expectations, cultural pressures, societal structures and norms, and even distorted identity and understanding of ourselves. These all can keep us from answering that invitation from Christ. So the question is, how can we truly allow ourselves, but also others, to respond to Jesus' invitation towards what gives us life? Well, Jesus' words today in the gospel about divorce have been distorted, weaponized, and used to control people in the past. Unfortunately, this has been done by the church, by individual people who are abusing others, as well as by well-meaning people who have lacked the context to understand what Jesus is truly addressing here. So let's go into that context. Jesus was being asked about divorce by people who had ulterior motives. John the Baptist had been publicly declaiming Herod Antipas and Herodias, the tetrarch and his second wife, who had originally been married to his half-brother. John was arrested and then beheaded at the request of Herodias' daughter Salome, who had danced for the court and been promised anything she asked for by her stepfather. She asked for John the Baptist's head, and that's what she got. Jesus had just entered Herod's domain, and if the Pharisees could get him to say something like what John the Baptist had been saying, well, then Jesus could be arrested, lose his head, and be cleanly dealt with, out of their way, out of the public eye. In this public eye where he was currently gaining so much attention in reversing the powers of authority of his day, the corrupt temple leadership's grip on the people was slipping. So when Jesus defends the rights of women to have a home and have a place, he is doing something incredibly dangerous. He's risking his head. And that is what he's doing, by the way. As usual, Jesus gives voice to the voiceless, protects the vulnerable, and attempts to teach everyone else around him to do the same. Jesus does not want women to be divorced by husbands who just don't want to be married to them anymore. He protects their right to inhabit a safe, respected place in the community. Because in Jesus' day, a divorced woman could be cast out onto the streets and have to beg to survive. And she would be begging from a society who was trained only to give their charity to the widows the orphaned, and the strangers in their lands. Divorced women were invisible to the temple and often starved, especially if their fathers or their brothers or other male relatives would not likely offer them shelter. And if a woman had no sons, she had no one to speak for her or to protect her from those who would do her harm. She may end up in prostitution or slavery just to be able to eat. And she had no prospect of improving her situation. That was it. So now with that context in mind, it makes far more sense. Jesus' true to form is not about following laws that will enable people to abuse one another by abusing those laws and shirk their responsibilities and follow their desires instead of choosing the harder path of faithfulness and love. He advocates for justice and fairness. The law in Jesus' teachings is only relevant and helpful if it is just. Okay, there's more to this passage. The second part of the gospel passage, where Jesus is having conversation with his disciples, he is condemning anyone who divorces and remarries to be equally responsible for adulterous behavior. And this is directed specifically at Herod and Herodias. A little bit more context here. Herod, the tetrarch, had divorced his Nabatean wife, who was the daughter of a neighboring king, very important person, adjoining Herod's lands. He divorced his first wife to marry Herodias, who was formerly the wife of his own half-brother. The two had met and begun an adulterous affair while Herod was visiting his brother, and they had plotted to cast off their current spouses so they could rule together and pool their authority. The marriage offended Herod's former father-in-law, as it would, and it also alienated his Jewish subjects. So it is the adultery, the cheating, the betrayal of promises to be faithful that Jesus condemns, and the selfishness that these rulers had allowed to impact their subjects so devastatingly, bringing about conflict and feuds that resulted in war with Herod's ex-father-in-law and other complex political ramifications with Rome and neighboring countries, which caused the people in Herod's territories to suffer terribly. Now, in the end, Herod and Herodias were banished from their lands and they spent the rest of their life in exile in Gaul. Not much is known of their later years, but we can assume they weren't happy ones. Once again, context is so important. So now that we have addressed that important biblical perspective and debunked the bad theology that divorce is never the answer, because we know that sometimes it is the only answer for people to not only survive, but also thrive and bring about just and fair living for everyone involved. It's not just for the couple that may be experiencing the death of a marriage, but for their family, their friends, and especially any children who are involved. Because children are the other vulnerable people that Jesus speaks for in the gospel today. We hear that people were bringing children to Jesus to have him bless them. And the disciples had spoken sternly to them, trying to send them away. But Jesus had said, no, don't stop them from coming to me, because it's to these little ones that the kingdom of heaven truly belongs. And anyone who does not enter the kingdom of heaven like a little child won't enter it at all. So the disciples had spoken sternly to the people bringing children to Jesus to bless. Why? Why on earth would they do this? What possessed them to gatekeep Jesus and to be bouncers that sent children away? What is that about? Okay, well, maybe, let's humor them. Maybe they felt that divorce wasn't an appropriate topic for their tender ears if this conversation that Jesus had been having publicly was then followed by this. We don't actually know how long between encounters. Now, we know that that's actually quite silly because it's important to be honest with children and to take their perspectives really seriously, because how else will kids learn and grow if we don't start speaking to them about adult things when they're young? How else also would the disciples expect the faith to spread, if not in the lives of those who had many years ahead of them and would likely outlive the disciples themselves? Okay, maybe that wasn't it. Maybe they just wanted Jesus to remain undistracted from his teaching them. And children often do offer wonderful distraction from our oh so adult conversations. They speak truth where we often retreat. They ask questions which we might hold within us as adults, too afraid to speak for fear of looking silly or stupid. They also offer really different ways of looking at things. Kids are really playful in their lives. They're also playful with their faith. They don't take things too seriously. At least they shouldn't have to. I commend a podcast to you to go a little bit deeper with this concept of play in spiritual living. It features Susanna from our friends at Benedictus Contemplative Church. It's on ABC's Soul Search. It's called Play as a Spiritual Practice. And it encourages the exploration of how playfulness in our adult lives as a whole, but also our spiritual experience, can lead us to new ways of experiencing God's love. So if you'd like to listen, I'll make sure I link it on the sermon page. I do commend it to you. Now, I reflect that having given many kids talks in the past within the hearing of adults in physical churches, I know that many grown-ups have got more out of the kids' talk that day than they did out of the sermon. And the reason I know this is because they told me so. The kids' talk is often for learning, whereas the sermon is for teaching. And perhaps it's a mental space to dream in and restore while the voice that is sharing the word through reflection holds space for you. By the way, I really appreciate when people zone out in my sermons. Give yourself full permission to experience them not as a lecture that you have to take notes in, but as a space for your soul to do what it needs to under the surface, and your mind to renew, maybe picking a few things up along the way. Maybe something will sink in, or maybe it won't. Give yourself a rest. And this, in and of itself, is what I think it means to be childlike, to receive what is given, to be open to the moment, to allow the mind, the soul, and the body to wander where it is beckoned by the Spirit, who meets us around every corner with a surprise. And that's also why at Holy Hermits Online, we send out activity sheets to everyone in our Friday sendouts. You are never too old to look at the Bible with a youthful perspective. So I hope even if you feel like it's been a long time since you did a colouring in page or an activity sheet, give it a go. Why not? Also, last Advent, we used colouring pages as part of our study. It's an acceptive, active listening process to colour in while you listen. And if you want to colour in worship, please bring your own colouring in. It'd be wonderful to see that happening in our space. It addresses this part of us that always remains innocent. Jesus said it is to children, the vulnerable, trusting, reliant, honest, curious children, that the kingdom of heaven belongs. Not in a possessive sense that it belongs to them and not to anybody else, but in a lived experience of openness to God. So it's being vulnerable that we lean into Jesus' invitation to life and abundance. And life and abundance is for everyone, not just the rich and powerful who have the ability to throw other people's lives into chaos if they are selfish, like Herod and Herodias. Not just those who are in positions of privilege, which would have been the men of Jesus' day in their marriages, seeking to discard wives they owed faithfulness to. Or the adults who have agency in a society where sometimes the reaction is to banish or silence children. Jesus invites life in abundance and the facilitation of it for everyone, especially those who don't have a voice at the moment. And it's the job of those of us who do have a voice to exercise it, to have that opportunity to safeguard, to nurture and advocate for the voiceless. We must take that charge up. Do not stop the little children or anyone who has need of God's love from approaching Jesus, and instead we encourage them to make that journey towards Christ. And by engaging in that practice, being with those who have that need, we will find the kingdom of God as our lived experience too. So how will we advocate for the voiceless in our midst? How will we care for those who depend on us? Today at worship, we will bless our animals, other innocents who have lived honestly with us, They have true lives of dependence and trust. We will continue to revel in creation, even though the season of creation for 2024 is now at an end. Because as St. Francis said, if you have people who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have people who will deal likewise with their fellow humans. So we will take our stewardship of the earth very seriously, but also playfully. And we will nurture our connection to nature, another vulnerable who desperately needs our care. We will look for ways to remain faithful in our relationships with others, with the earth, but especially with our Creator, and try and be a support and a voice for those who are suffering injustice of any kind. And that's a start. We will meet the life-giving God in the rest. Amen.